Hey, I'm Nikki G. Welcome to Better Commander. Today we're going to be talking about Runo Stromkirk, and we're going to talk about building a commander deck and the various strategies you're going to need to totally overwhelm your play group with sea monsters, krakens, all that fun stuff. Okay, let's take a look at the card itself. Runo Stromkirk is a legendary creature, vampire cleric. He costs 1 blue and a black. When he enters the battlefield, put up to 1 target creature card from your graveyard on top of your library. At the beginning of your upkeep, look at the top card of your library. You may reveal that card. If it's a creature card with mana value 6 or greater, transform Runo Stromkirk. And he transforms into Krothuss, Lord of the Deep, legendary creature, Kraken Horror. It's got flying. When he attacks, create a tapped and attacking token that's a copy of another target attacking creature. If that creature is a Kraken, Leviathan, Octopus, or Serpent, create 2 of those tokens instead. So there's a lot going on with Runo Stromkirk, and we're going to explore some of the strategies we need to flip them and some of the cool, huge creatures we want to copy as well. Alright, when you're building a commander deck, you want to think about what strategies are integral to the deck's core functions. So with Runo Stromkirk, we're going to talk about a little ramp, and we're going to talk about milling cards into the graveyard. We're going to talk about looting, so that's drawing a card and discarding a card for card velocity and to cycle through our deck really quickly. We're going to talk about some cycling cards that get themselves in the graveyard and are also big beaters. We're going to talk about our haste enablers. And we're going to talk about card advantage in our colors. We're going to talk about the sea monsters that make the deck fun. So you're going to want to include the old standbys, Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, Demir's Signet, Talisman of Dominance, cards like that. You might want to think about cards that mill as well to add mana, so Deranged Assistant, Milliken. Another card that I want to highlight a little bit is Dreamscape Artist. So Dreamscape Artist is 1 and a blue for a 1/1 human spell shaper. So he's got this activated ability, 2 and a blue, tap, discard a card, sacrifice a land, and then you get to search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, put them onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. Note that it does not say put those 2 basic lands onto the battlefield tapped. So you can put them onto the battlefield and then double spell that turn, or perhaps cast Runo Stromkirk. Hopefully one of the cards that you're discarding is going to be a big monster fatty that got stuck in your hand at the beginning of the game. So picture this play pattern. On turn 2 you cast Looteril Core. On your next turn you put out your land, Looteril Core attacks, deals damage to an opponent because he's got Shadow, you draw a card, then discard a card. Hopefully you're discarding a card with converted mana cost 6 or greater. Then you cast Runo Stromkirk, you put that card on top of your library, and you're good to go for the next turn to reveal it and flip Runo Stromkirk into Krothuss. These little looters are pretty good little cards to copy for the first time with Runo as well, because you're probably not going to have a big beater on the battlefield when you attack with them for the first time. So we have Looteril Core, Lore Broker, it's kind of a bit of a hug card, as well as Merfolk Looter in our 2 converted mana cost slots. At 3 mana value, we have Obsessive Stitcher, Varragoth, Bloodsky Sire, and Monastery Siege. Obsessive Stitcher is a great card in this deck. It's a looter, it's also a recursion spell. Varragoth, Bloodsky Sire can stack the top of our library, can get us whatever we need, perhaps a reanimation spell if needed, if we have one of our large creatures in the graveyard. Monastery Siege, you're probably going to want to choose cons. At the beginning of your draw step, draw an additional card, then discard a card. I also added some classic cards like Brainstorm, Frantic Search, and Windfall. Windfall effects are great in this deck because they help you stack your graveyard as well as to refill your hand for whatever you need at that moment. Frantic Search is basically a free spell. You cast it on turn 3 and then cast Runo Stromkirk, putting one of the cards you discarded back on top of the library. And Brainstorm is one of those cards that you're going to see a lot in Commander. It's basically just a cantrip, but it helps you stack the top of your library for Runo's impending transformation. Now we're getting into some of the fun stuff. So these big beaters put themselves in the graveyard. Striped Riverwinder has cycling for 1 blue. Discard this card, draw a card. Scion of Darkness has cycling for 3 generic mana. Discard this card from your hand, draw a card. I've loved this card forever. It's not necessarily worth 8 mana. However, it's a great reanimation target. So it's a 6/6 creature avatar with trample. When Sign of Darkness deals combat damage to a player, you may put target creature card from that player's graveyard into play under your control. Just kind of a fun card to put in the deck, for sure. Waker of Waves is a 7 CMC 7/7 creature whale. Creatures your opponents control get -1/-0. 1 in a blue, discard Waker of Waves. Look at the top 2 cards of your library. Put one of them into your hand and the other into your graveyard. So in addition to putting Waker of Waves in your graveyard, you might hit on a juicy reanimation target, like one of the sea monsters we're going to discuss in a few minutes. I wanted to briefly touch on some haste enablers for this deck. Lightning Greaves and Swiftfoot Boots are great protection for Runo Stromkirk or Krothuss, and Crashing Drawbridge will grant all of our creatures haste. So when we reanimate one of these big juicy targets out of the graveyard, we can have them swing and get copied by Krothuss the turn that they come out. So imagine if our commander didn't have all the text about sea monsters and just had the text create a token that's a copy of target attacking creature you control. What type of effects would you want to copy? Well, these types of effects. We have Sire of Stagnation. He's a 5/7, so he's got a pretty decent stat line. He's also a card advantage engine that just kind of sits there and helps us to draw into some of our win conditions. A budget bomb in this deck, it's only about $2. Burning Rune Demon helps us to get a big juicy card into our hand and also a big juicy card into our graveyard. In this particular deck, it doesn't really matter what our opponents pick. Just pick the 2 best cards in your deck, 2 best creature cards, put one in the graveyard, one into your hand, and then reanimate the one that went to the graveyard, and you're going to be in good shape either way. Dream Eater also helps us to transform Runo by surveilling when he enters the battlefield. He also has an added bounce spell tacked on to his body. And Agent of Treachery is just a jerk card for jerks, but I like it. And if you start making copies, you're going to end up drawing cards on your end step as well. Sphinx of Uthun is Fact or Fiction on a stick. I use this card in a lot of decks. I think it's an awesome card. Perhaps it's a bit overcosted and a bit overused, but it's very cheap right now. I think it's literally about 10 cents, and I think it makes a great addition to this deck. As far as sea monsters go, I wanted to include ones that would really impact the board, and not just any sea monster that was a generic big beater. Hullbreaker Horror is a really cool card out of Crimson Vow. I think this card is going to be a staple in the future. I picked up 4 copies when it was first spoiled for about $8 each. Spawning Kraken is another excellent card in this deck. That card's going to win you games. It's going to create a tremendous amount of power and toughness onto the battlefield. Serpent of Yawning Depths gives everything evasion unless your opponents are running sea monsters. Gyruda Doom of Depths, you're not going to get 2 copies of this, but you're going to get 2 copies of the Enter the Battlefield effect before they die to the legend rule. So hopefully that'll help you get some big stuff out of your opponent's graveyard and possibly out of your own graveyard as well. Scourge of Fleets is a one-sided board wipe. It's a great Kraken creature to include in the deck. Stormtide Leviathan is a bit of a control card for this deck, and nothing without flying or island walk is going to be able to attack, which can be a real crutch for our opponents. Since we're filling our graveyard, we might as well bring some Reanimator. Necromancy, Exhume, Persist, Reanimate, Animate Dead. These are all great cards to include. Their converted mana cost is cheap, although they can be expensive dollar-wise. I also included things like Incarnation Technique and Victimize that could potentially bring 2 big beaters out of the graveyard. You can sacrifice a small creature to victimize perhaps one of our looters and bring back 2 giant sea monsters. Incarnation Technique, you have to let one of your opponents do this as well, but you select the person who will hopefully not get a big creature out of the graveyard, or someone who doesn't have anything in their graveyard to begin with, although they're going to end up milling 5 cards and maybe get something cool off of that. I think it's a small price to pay to get guaranteed big fatty out of the graveyard. There's some miscellaneous cards I want to talk about here that I think go great in this deck. Heartless Summoning is an enchantment for 1 and a black. Creature spells you cast cost 2 less to cast. Creatures you control get -1/-1. So this is a bit of a non-bow with some of our looters. But getting Burning Room Demon or a big creature like that out on turn 4 is really awesome and will help accelerate copying with Krothuss. Sea Dasher Octopus can mutate onto one of our looters as well, or onto Krothuss himself, so that whenever we deal combat damage, we're drawing a card. Note that that's also a copyable attribute, the mutation effect. So if you put it on an evasive flyer or something like that, you're going to get the benefit when he's copied by Krothuss. I also included some removal on giant creatures, Noxious Gear Hulk, cards like Duplicant, Meteor Golem. These are all pretty budget cards. Overseer of the Damned are all converted mana cost 6 or greater and will help you remove threats from the board. Whelming Wave is going to be pretty much a one-sided board wipe in this deck and is kind of an auto include. I also included Wonder to give our sea monsters flying. Once we get it into the graveyard, we should have an island by that point in the game. Halimar Depths I don't think is a fantastic card in and of itself, but it can help us stack the top of our deck for Runo Stromkirk to transform. And cards like Buried Alive, Unmarked Graves, Entomb if you have one and it's not outside your budget, can also be great for stacking our graveyard. So you want to round out the deck list with some removal, some interaction. Blue is great with counter spells. You may also want to include some ancillary card draw, cards like Fact or Fiction, those types of cards. At the end of the day, this is not a hyper competitive deck, although it can be very explosive. You may put 50 power onto the board and win a war of attrition with people. The main win condition is probably combat damage with a bit of control. So let me know what you guys think of this deck list. I'm going to put the link in the description, and I wish you all happy brewing.